So the respiratory system, what they do is basically, although the word is being used as respiratory, but it is actually, in reality, it's like a ventilation system, meaning this particular system help body to get the oxygen, because we know oxygen is required by the cell to produce ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the energy molecule. And I believe you learned that in a cell metabolism chapter earlier. That is where, in the electron transport chain, at the end, oxygen act as the final acceptor of electron, and therefore body can make a lot of ATP. So basically, to fulfill that demand of having enough oxygen in the body, this respiratory system comes into the picture. But transportation of oxygen that happens through the blood, it's cardiovascular system, and obviously metabolism is completely different. So respiratory system deals with oxygen getting into the lung and getting carbon dioxide out from the lung, or the waste product that produced during the cellular respiration out of the lung. So in order to understand the respiration a little bit more, this is how we divide into the 4 stages. So pulmonary ventilation, external respiration, transport, and internal respiration. So pulmonary ventilation means moving the air from the environment into your lung. Air, we know air is a mixture of gases. One of the gases is oxygen. So in other words, taking the oxygen into your lung, and then carbon dioxide comes out from the lung. So moving in and out by a process called breathing is pulmonary ventilation. Then what happens is, as soon as we breathe in, that oxygen, I'm going to use the word oxygen instead of air, because within the air, as we know, air is a mixture of gases, but oxygen is the one that our interest. So oxygen goes into a space called alveolus. Alveolus is singular, alveoli is plural. Alveolus, if you think, is like a cul-de-sac. It's like a dead-end pocket. So it's basically called blind pocket or alveolus. So when you're breathing in, that oxygen from the air, like from outside environment, through a pipeline, which is known as respiratory tract, goes into finally a blind pocket called alveolus. Now, each alveolus, we have millions of them, each alveolus, which is a microscopic structure, is surrounded by a lot of blood capillaries. So when oxygen reaches to that alveolus, the oxygen concentration is high in alveolus, low in the blood. So we know, according to the diffusion, the molecules move from high concentration to wherever they are low concentration. So oxygen will automatically move from alveolus to the blood vessel, meaning to the blood. And when it goes to the blood, that blood will go from the lung to the left atria in the heart, and then from left atrium, it goes to the left ventricle and pumped to the body. So that gas exchange, which is taking place at the alveolus level, is called external respiration. Finally, transportation, basically taken by the lung and taken by the blood from the lung to the tissues and coming back. So that's cardiovascular system, and internal respiration, which is gas exchange between the blood vessels and the tissue where the oxygen goes into the cell. It's also nothing to do with the respiratory system. So respiratory system basically deals with these first 2. Respiratory system basically deals with pulmonary ventilation and external respiration. These are the 2 things. So in order to learn respiratory system, this is what we need to do. We need to know the respiratory tract that is going from the nose or mouth to the alveolus. Alveolus is singular, alveoli is plural. And then what exactly happening at the alveolus. meaning external respiration, or we can say at gas exchange. So these are the two things which in respiratory system we're going to focus. So what is the main function of the respiratory system? So obvious function number one is moving air from the environment to the lung and take it back to the environment with the waste product, provide extensive surface area so that gas exchange can take place at the alveolus level, protecting the respiratory surface, although arguably that could be a function of the defense system like lymphatic systems or immune system, produces sound. So this is like a side function of respiratory system, meaning when the oxygen or air is traveling in and out, the sound can be formed due to the vibration of a couple of structures that we are going to, it's called vocal cord, we're going to talk about that later. And finally, olfactory, meaning the smell, olfactory sensation is actually helped by the respiratory system, although nervous system is responsible for final olfaction or the smell, but respiratory system help nervous system to reach that goal. So that's our function. This is an overall anatomy of the respiratory system, starting with nose or mouth. Both can be responsible for respiration. The air goes in. If it goes through the nose, it goes through these structures of bones and internal nerves. I'm going to mention 2 seconds later. Or if it goes from the mouth, it goes to this area we call pharynx. From the pharynx, it goes down to the larynx. Right here at that junction, one part of larynx made with a lot of cartilages. So one of the cartilages in the larynx help the distinction between food and the air. In case of food, which goes to the mouth and goes on the back side, like a posterior side through the esophagus to the stomach. But air can go both ways. So for air, it really doesn't matter whether you have a lead or not. Food cannot come to this pipeline because otherwise it's going to stuck at lungs. But air, if it goes through the esophagus, which it normally goes, it goes to the stomach. It's no big deal. So anyway, for the respiratory system, the air goes from nose or mouth to the pharynx to the larynx, then a very extended pipeline known as trachea. And that trachea bifurcate. When they bifurcate, those are called bronchus. So from nose or mouth to the pharynx, to larynx, to trachea, then trachea create bronchus. Obviously, when it goes to the left lung, we call left bronchus, goes to the right lung, right bronchus. And then bronchus divided more. So the first division we call primary or 1 degree bronchus, second division, secondary, or the second degree, and the third division called tertiary. And then eventually it even produces narrower branches, we call them bronchioles. Then at the end, we call that terminal bronchioles. But here is a very important thing to remember. Terminal bronchioles, although the word terminal sounds its end, but it is actually not the end. So terminal bronchiole then produce a lot of fine branches. We call them respiratory bronchiole. And that respiratory bronchiole, they create a tiny duct called alveolar duct, which goes into a blind pocket called alveolus. So let's look at that structure first. So right here, the trachea bifurcate into 2 branches. So those are bronchi. Bronchi is the plural of bronchus. So this one left primary. And when they branches again, so this branch will be a secondary bronchus. Then when the secondary branches again, those will be tertiary bronchus or tertiary bronchi, multiple of them. And then finally, they create bronchioles, which become like terminal bronchiole. Then each terminal bronchiole produces thousands of respiratory bronchioles. That's basically a microscopic structure right there. And then respiratory bronchiole, excuse me, this respiratory bronchiole then goes and emptied themselves in a dead end. or like a cul-de-sac, that space, that's called alveolus. So this is completely microscopic structure. So as soon as you breathe in, follow the air travel. As soon as you breathe in, air goes from nose or mouth to the same place called pharynx. From pharynx, it goes to larynx. From larynx, it goes to trachea. Then trachea, it travels to the left or right lung. So left bronchus or right bronchus. It goes to primary, secondary, tertiary, and terminal bronchial. Finally goes to respiratory bronchial. Then respiratory bronchial ends on a dead end called alveolus. So this holds, this individually, they are alveolus, plural is alveoli. Millions of them, these microscopic structures are in our lung. Now, individually, each one is surrounded like a spider web of blood vessels or a network of blood vessels. So if you imagine that individual alveolus is like a tennis ball, and then the tennis ball is surrounded with a blood capillary network. So now what happens is when oxygen reaches here in this sac, in this container, the oxygen concentration here is high. Blood vessel, obviously, we have used the oxygen, so oxygen is poor concentration of oxygen. In other words, lower concentration of oxygen. So oxygen should follow from high to the low. So if you look at the microscopic structure, this is a microscopic structure of the alveolus. So individually, each alveolus is made with a squamous epithelial cells. Those cells are called pneumocyte type 1 cells. So the squamous or flat epithelial cells create individual tennis ball. I'm intentionally using the word tennis ball to make you understand that tennis ball is nothing but each alveolus. Now, apart from those squamous or type 1 cell, there are two other kind of cell as well, which is a little bit different function. Those two cells are pneumocyte type 2, or called septal cells, and alveolar macrophage. So this one in this picture, they put a little bit yellowish color. Those are septal cells. Obviously, there are few of them in each alveolus, and these are alveolar macrophage. These two has totally different function. They are not the primary structure-oriented cell. They are just there to fulfill other function. So alveolar macrophage, what they do, they're also known as dust cells. So obviously from the name dust cells, I mean they clean up. So they are basically our last line of defense right there for lung. So they phagocyte any particle that escape from our defenses in the pharynx, larynx, and trachea, so that we can have a healthy lung. And pneumocyte type 2 cells or septal cells, they're very interesting function. They produce a surfactant. What is surfactant is basically if the alveolus, when they breathe out the air into them, if you allow a microscopic structure to become empty, so they will collapse the structure. So the alveolar wall will come together because of surface tension, and they will keep it collapsed. So now every time you have to breathe harder to keep that alveolus or make that alveolus open again. So what body wants, body does not want alveoli to collapse completely. And how can you prevent that collapsing? Is to prevent that they don't want them to come, the wall come too close together. So they create an oily secretion, or it acts like a soap, which reduces the surface tension, thereby keeps the alveoli not to collapse. So they keep open. So by the way, pneumocyte type 2 and alveolar macrophage has nothing to do with the external respiration or gas exchange. So let's go back to the type 1 cells, which is the major one that make the alveolar macrophage. So type 1 cells or the squamous epithelial cell. So obviously epithelial cells means they have a basement membrane. So this is an alveolar epithelial cells in this picture. So alveolar epithelial cells, so one of them, if you're looking at, so alveolar epithelial cells, that's the basement membrane. So the gray color in this picture, the purple color is the alveolar epithelial, and then the gray color is basically the basement membrane. Now blood capillary, on the other hand, also is endothelial cells or basically squamous cells. So that's also epithelial cells. So they also do have a basement membrane. So both their cellular basement membrane get fused. So now we have three things: alveolar epithelia, then the basement membrane, which is fused, and the endothelial cells, which is commonly known as endothelial, basically capillary epithelial cells. Together, these microscopic structures is approximately 0.5 micrometer width. So they are not very thick. They're looking thick in this picture, but they're a very, very narrow structure in the microscopic structure. So what happened when oxygen high concentration on the alveolus and low here in the blood, oxygen can diffuse. So oxygen diffuse this way from alveolus to the blood, carbon dioxide diffuse from blood to the alveolus, and that phenomena is called gas exchange. It happens through these three layers, which is commonly known as respiratory membrane. So the respiratory membrane is nothing but the squamous epithelial cell lining up the alveolus, this one, the endothelial lining up the adjacent capillary, that one, and the fused basal lamina, which is basement membrane of these two cells. So this is known as respiratory membrane. So respiratory membrane, where the gas exchange takes place. So now we know, as soon as you breathe, the air goes from the mouth or nose to the pharynx, then to larynx, then to trachea, then to left or right bronchus, depending on which lung you are looking at. And then from there, you divide primary, secondary, tertiary bronchioles, eventually terminal bronchioles. Then terminal bronchioles produce a lot of branches called respiratory bronchioles, microscopic structure, obviously, and finally to the alveoli. So if you look at the entire structure from nose or mouth to the alveolus, only the microscopic part is the respiratory bronchiole and the alveolus. The rest are not, they are thick structures. So the oxygen and carbon dioxide cannot diffuse past this structure at all. So that's why from here to, like, from the nose or mouth to the terminal bronchioles, that structure we call conducting zone structure, meaning that particular part of the respiratory structure from nose to pharynx to larynx to trachea to all the bronchus and then finally to the terminal bronchiole is carrying the air, nothing else. So they do not participate in any kind of exchange because they're thick. The molecules cannot move from one part to another. So that's called conducting zone structure. But where the respiration or the gas exchange takes place, which are respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and alveoli, those structures are called respiratory zone structure. So respiratory zone structure where the external respiration or gas exchange takes place. Conducting zone structure where air flow, they act as a conduit, they act as a pipeline. So air goes from one place to another place, no other functional responsibility. So now let's go back to the upper structure one more time to take a deeper look. So when the air goes into the nose or mouth, it reaches to the pharynx. But as soon as we are studying respiratory structure, we are not going to focus on mouth so much because we are going to learn that in digestive system anyway. So air goes, so I'm going to mention more about nose here. So air goes in through this vestibule with the cartilaginous structure. We have that this area is called external nares or outside part of the nose. So the air goes in right there. There are a lot of hair, that cilia or hair that actually prevent the larger particles such as pollen or any other larger dust particle can go through. So that's the first line of defense in this case. And then air moves inside the nose. Inside the nose, those are bony structures. In AP1, you studied those are like extension of ethmoid bone and inferior nasal concha. So those nasal concha created like a roadblock. So they create a roadblock. So what will happen? They create a narrow passageways for the air. These narrow passageways are called metaces. In this picture, they didn't mention that, but if these are the bony structure or the concha, bone structure, these narrow gaps are called metasis. Metasis word means narrow passageways. So as soon as the air goes here and they face the roadblock, they obviously try to squeeze into these narrow passages, and this create a turbulence in that air. And that turbulence has some physiological advantages. What kind of physiological advantages? Because then your body is getting enough time to either warm the air if it is outside is extremely cold, or like cool the air if the outside is hot or warm days. Okay, so they can act like an air conditioner machine right there, because you do not want to take very cold air in your lung, your lung will freeze, or you do not want to take a very warm air to your lung so that your lung will dehydrate. So both are not good. So that's where the temperature regulation comes into the place. So that turbulence gives extra time or for the nasal membrane to work on it. Now, the turbulence also take care of the humidity of the air. So you want a moist air to go in. So that's humidity. And finally, that turbulence helps the immune system, the cells that are on the nasal membrane, get a chance to get activated to kill any bacteria, virus, or any other pathogens to pass through them. So this turbulence in the air has a lot of functions. So provide an airway for respiration, moisturizing, moistening and warming the air, the filtering the air, obviously cleaning the foreign matter, serving as a resonating chamber for speech. That's a separate function, nothing to do with the immune system, and housing the olfactory receptors, meaning the smell, all the receptors, the nervous system receptors are located at your nose. So these things can be also taken care, apart from the olfaction part, all these things can be taken care of the mouth as well. So this is anatomically external nares, air goes in, all the nasal concha, all the nasal metasis between the concha, internal nares, meaning internal part of the nose. Right back of the internal nares, this long area is called pharynx. Pharynx is divided into three parts: nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx, the bottom part. So nasopharynx is behind the nose, oropharynx behind the oris or oral cavities, mouth cavity. So behind the mouth is called oropharynx, and below here is called laryngopharynx because this part is close to the larynx. So pharynx is a structure that just carry either the air or part of the pharynx carry food too. So nasopharynx, the first part, carry only air, and oropharynx and laryngopharynx carry air and the food both, but they do not have any other function. Only thing they involve in the immune system, you're going to learn, they have cells that can protect the body from outside pathogens. Then comes the larynx. The larynx is also commonly known as voice box because our vocal cords are located there. Larynx made with 9 cartilages. Larynx made with 9 cartilages. 3 of them are paired and 3 of them are unpaired. So those 3 unpaired cartilages are thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, this one on the bottom, cricoid cartilage, and epiglottis, that's acting like a lead. That's epiglottis, which act like a lead. So right here, this is epiglottis that act like a lead. What kind of lead? Because when you eat food, as soon as you swallow the food material, this lead should close so that they act like a chute. Excuse me. So that helps the food to slide into the esophagus. So that is why we are not supposed to talk while you are eating, because if you talk, because your vocal cord is inside the larynx, air comes out. So you're basically accidentally giving a chance of food to get into the trachea and cause choking. So this epiglottis acting like a lead over to prevent the food going into the larynx and therefore in the trachea. So 3 unpaired cartilages are thyroid cartilage, huge thyroid cartilage, because your thyroid gland is located right here. That's why the name. And then a cricoid cartilage right here in the bottom. and then finally the epiglottis, which is on the top acting like a lid. Those are three unpaired. Three paired, six of them, three paired are cuneiform cartilage, corniculate cartilage, and arytenoid cartilage. So arytenoid cartilage is the bottom. On top of that, that's a corniculate cartilage, that tiny cartilage on the top. And the cuneiform cartilage is embedded on the ligament that we have. So they are embedded right there. That's called cuneiform cartilage. So there are three cartilages which are paired, are cuneiform, corniculate, arytenoid. Three unpaired are thyroid, cricoid, and epiglottis. So together, these 9 cartilages made our structure called larynx. Inside the larynx, if you put a camera through it, that's the picture you're going to see. This is also known as, this part is also known as glottis. That's where the vocal cord is. Glottis, that's what the vocal cord is. That's what epiglottis covered the glottis. Epiglottis is a lid that covers the glottis. So glottis is where the vocal cord is, and when the air passing through them, those cords vibrate, which produce sound. Trachea. So after larynx, the air goes to the trachea. Trachea is made with 15 to 20 cartilages. 50 to 20 cartilages, ring-like structure that make almost a foot-long pipeline called trachea. Very interesting structure inside, because the innermost layer of the trachea is a pseudo-stratified columnar epithelial cells. They're ciliated, so any food particle goes in, those cilia beat, so they help the food particle to take them out. Okay? And they're C-ring structure. C-ring means it looks like a letter C. So in this picture, it's looking like a kind of U, but we call them C-shaped, because C-shaped because one side is open. So what side is open? Posterior side. Because remember, on the back of the trachea, we have another pipeline called esophagus. When you swallow food, because you swallow and you do not swallow and breathe at the same time. So when you swallow, you don't breathe. So when you swallow food, the esophagus expanded. They have room to expand right here. If this is whole thing will be cartilage, like a O-ring structure, then esophagus will have hard time to expand, because on the back side you have vertebral column, which is bony structure as well. So trachea, their back has a trachealis muscle, which helps esophagus to expand into the trachea, because as I said, you do not swallow or breathe at the same time. So when you swallowing, you do not breathe. So this, for the anterior part is a tough cartilage, posterior part is open, which helps esophagus to expand. We have 15 to 20 cartilaginous structure. At the bottom, there's a V-shaped cartilage. That V-shaped cartilage, which is also known as carina, C-A-R-I-N-A, carina, that's V-shaped cartilage, like a bottom of a boat that helps into bifurcation of the trachea into two pipelines called left and right bronchus. So that's the primary bronchus. That's our primary structure, which is going to differentiate into secondary and tertiary lobe. This primary bronchus, both of them, like two bronchi, has a little bit of differences. What kind of differences? Very interesting differences. The right bronchus, which going to the right lung, is slightly wider, and not only slightly wider, they're steeper compared to the left. So left is a little bit less wider and less steeper. That is why if a particle escapes, the most chance of the particle goes to the right lung. Okay. Most chance of the particle goes to, so most of the pollutants can also go to the right lung. So right lung can have more damage compared to the left lung, because of the steepness of these bronchus, as well as they're wider in shape. So those are the two differences between those two primary bronchi. Apart from that, so right bronchus is wider and steep compared to the left. And now when it goes to the lung, the right, because right lung and left lung, there is a difference. Right lung has 3 lobes, left lung has 2 lobes. So therefore, right bronchus, they produce 3 secondary bronchi, because they have to serve all 3 lobes. And left bronchus, they produce 2 secondary bronchi, because they are going to serve only 2 lobes. So if you look at the right lung and the left lung, the right lung has 3 lobes, superior, inferior, and the middle lobe, and left lung has 2 lobes. So the bronchus, the primary bronchus, when they go in, the secondary is 3 of them, like 1, 2, and 3. So and the left, they just create two secondary. So each secondary bronchus supply to individual lobe. And how they make the lobe? Using the fissure. Fissure is like a deep cut. So in the right lung, because they have three lobes, they need two fissure. One is horizontal fissure, one is oblique fissure. So oblique and horizontal fissure create those three lobes. On the other hand, in the left lung, we have only one fissure called oblique fissure. So horizontal fissure is absent here because we need two lobes, superior and inferior. But there is a notch here, which is called cardiac notch on the left lung to accommodate the heart. Now, if you do remember, the heart is tilted towards the left, and heart apex is at the bottom, and they're tilted towards the left. So they need a little bit space. So that space created by that groove, or the space or the notch that created by the left lung, is known as cardiac notch. So this anatomically, right lung has three lobes, superior, inferior, and middle lobe, and left lung has two lobes, superior and inferior lobe. Right lung has two fissure, horizontal and oblique. Left lung has only oblique fissure, one fissure. The top of the lung is called apex. The bottom of the lung is called base, which is sitting on the diaphragm muscle. In case of heart, the apex and base was just a little bit opposite. We already know how the bronchioles divides, and we also know at the end, those terminal bronchioles that create a lot of respiratory bronchioles, which is like, a bunch of grapes that looks like a alveolar duct to the alveoli. And we also know how the oxygen, which is the main component that we are interested in, that get exchanged between the alveolus and the blood, and carbon dioxide come from blood to the alveolus, and then you breathe back. So this is the histological structure of the lung. Three types of cell. Type 1, that's a major cells of the alveolus. They create the alveolus, they make the alveolus, they're the primary component. Then you have two special cells, pneumocyte type 2 and alveolar macrophage. I already discussed their function. We already talked, this is the function of the septal cells. We already talked about respiratory and conducting zone structure. So in short, in summary, if we go back right here on the, so basically the air, which is a mixture of gases, contain oxygen, the one of our interest, goes through the nose or the mouth, then they follow through the pharynx area. The top part is nasopharynx, this is the oropharynx, this laryngopharynx. Then it goes to the larynx. Larynx is a cartilaginous structure. We have 9 cartilages associated with larynx, 3 of them paired, 3 of them unpaired. You should know all the names and all the locations where they're located. Then it goes through the trachea, a pipeline which made by 15 to 20 C-shaped cartilages. They're C-shaped because they're posteriorly open so that esophagus get a chance to expand when they carry the food bolus. And at the bottom of the trachea, there is a V-shaped cartilage. We call that carina, which helps make 2 bronchi, left and right. Those are primary bronchus. They go into the lung, and then they bifurcate more. So in case of right lung, they produce 3 branches, so 3 secondary bronchi, because right lung has 3 lobes, superior, middle, and the inferior lobe, and left lung has 2 lobes, so they create only 2 secondary bronchi, 1 for each lobe. Those lobes are created by fissure. So left lung, because they have 2 lobes, they have only 1 oblique fissure. The right lung, they have 1 oblique and 1 horizontal fissure. The apex of the lung is on the top, the base sitting on the diaphragm muscles, and the bronchi then branches into bronchioles, finally to the terminal bronchiole, which produce the respiratory bronchiole, the microscopic structure where gas exchange can take place. And most gas exchange takes place in the alveoli anyway. Those are completely microscopic bubble. That's like, I'm using the word bubble to make you understand. It's like a cul-de-sac, which is surrounded by a lot of blood capillaries. So the oxygen and carbon dioxide can diffuse back and forth through a membrane we call respiratory membrane. And respiratory membrane is made with 3 things. The squamous epithelial cells of the alveolus, the squamous epithelial cells of the blood capillary, and the fused basement membrane in their middle. together. The thickness is not more than 0.5 micrometer, which is thin enough for oxygen and carbon dioxide produce diffusion. So this is the anatomy part of the respiratory system.